In January of 2024, something strange started happening at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Truckers who had been hauling freight containers for years, some for decades, were suddenly told they couldn't register their rigs in a state database anymore, not because anything was wrong with their trucks and not because they'd failed a safety inspection. The reason was simpler and stranger than that. Their trucks ran on diesel. The California Air Resources Board had just flipped a switch. From that point forward, the only new drayage trucks allowed to register for port and rail yard access in California had to be zero-emission vehicles, battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell, nothing else. But that was only one piece of a regulatory puzzle that had been building for years across the halls of Sacramento. And the full picture was about to get much more complicated. How does someone go from owning a perfectly legal commercial truck to suddenly being told their vehicle has an expiration date stamped on it by the state government? It starts with the air. California has the worst air quality in the United States. The geography of the Los Angeles basin traps pollution between mountains and ocean, and decades of car culture and freight movement have turned smog into a public health crisis measured in hospital visits, childhood asthma rates, and cancer clusters near highways and rail corridors. The diesel exhaust pouring from heavy trucks contains over 40 known carcinogens and microscopic particles that lodge deep in lung tissue. Back in the 1970s, the Federal Clean Air Act gave California a unique privilege that no other state has ever received. Because of how severe the smog problem was, Congress allowed California to set its own vehicle emission standards, stricter than the federal ones. The agency created to enforce those standards was the California Air Resources Board, known as CARB. And for over 50 years, CARB has been the most aggressive air quality regulator in the country, capable of forcing automakers and truck manufacturers to meet standards that Washington never imposed. Other states couldn't write their own rules, but under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, they could adopt California's rules word for word. And over the decades, state legislatures from Boston to Salem adopted California's emissions rules word for word. For a long time, CARB focused on tightening emissions limits, requiring better filters, cleaner diesel formulas, and newer engine technology. Trucks got dramatically cleaner. By the 2020s, a single new diesel truck produced 99% fewer nitrogen oxides and particulate emissions than a truck from the 1980s. 60 of today's trucks emit what one truck did in 1988. By any measure, that was a dramatic transformation in the diesel engine's environmental footprint, but CARB decided it wasn't enough. The state had committed to slashing greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and the transportation sector, responsible for over 40% of California's total emissions, was the biggest obstacle. Cleaner diesel was no longer the goal. The goal was no diesel at all. In June of 2020, CARB's board members voted unanimously inside the Sacramento hearing room to adopt the Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation, the first rule of its kind anywhere on Earth. It didn't ban truck owners from driving diesel. Instead, it targeted the manufacturers. Starting with the 2024 model year, truck makers had to ensure that a rising percentage of their California sales were zero-emission vehicles. By 2035, those targets for truck sales at California dealerships would reach 55% for lighter commercial vehicles and 75% for heavier straight trucks. The clock had started, and then CARB went further. What came next was the regulation that turned the entire trucking industry against Sacramento. In April 2023, the board voted unanimously inside that same Sacramento hearing room to adopt the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation. This one didn't just target manufacturers, it went after the people buying the trucks. Large fleet operators with 50 or more vehicles or $50 million in annual revenue would be required to start purchasing only zero-emission trucks. Drayage operators hauling containers from the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Oakland would face the earliest deadline. By 2035, every drayage truck at California's ports and rail yards would need to be zero emission. And by 2036, the sale of any new diesel medium or heavy-duty truck in California would be banned entirely. Full stop. The reaction from the trucking industry was immediate and furious. The American Trucking Associations called the timelines unrealistic. Owner-operators pointed to a simple math problem. A new diesel Class 8 tractor costs roughly $175,000. A comparable electric Class 8 truck lists above $300,000. And that's before you factor in charging infrastructure, which can run tens of thousands more per vehicle in electrical upgrades, construction, and utility connection fees. If you're wondering how that's even legal, you're not alone. California's HVIP voucher program offered significant financial help, covering up to 90% of an electric truck's cost in some cases. After incentives, a $400,000 electric truck could come down to around $140,000 cheaper than a new diesel. But those vouchers weren't unlimited, and they weren't guaranteed to last. Small operators running 2 or 3 trucks in the Central Valley didn't always qualify. And the charging infrastructure to support a full-scale transition simply didn't exist yet across rural freight corridors. Meanwhile, the cost-per-mile equation on California's freight corridors was starting to shift in interesting ways. Electric trucks cost about 15 to 25 cents per mile in energy, compared to 50 to 70 cents per mile for diesel at the fuel pump. Maintenance costs were lower too, with fewer moving parts and no diesel particulate filters to replace. Analysts at Bernstein published a finding that the Tesla Semi had achieved a 3% total cost of ownership advantage over the Freightliner Cascadia diesel. In a business where profit margins run between 2 and 5%, that kind of edge matters. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The Tesla Semi was dominating California's incentive pipeline. In the HVIP voucher round covering January 2025 through early 2026, Tesla accounted for 965 of 1,067 Class 8 tractor voucher applications. Daimler, Packer, and Volvo combined received fewer than 100. One company was absorbing the vast majority of California's electric truck subsidy dollars, while traditional manufacturers were still figuring out production. So why were fleet buyers in California still hesitant to order electric trucks from their dealership lots? Range remained the sticking point. Most electric Class 8 trucks offer 200 to 300 miles per charge. Diesel trucks go 600 to 1,000 miles between fuel stops. For a long-haul operator crossing state lines with a loaded trailer, electric still wasn't viable. The technology worked best for port drayage, local delivery, and fixed-route regional hauling, exactly the use cases California was targeting first. Now here's where the dominoes started falling outside California's borders. 11 states adopted CARB's Advanced Clean Trucks rule. Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Washington went live with the 2025 model year. Vermont followed for 2026. Colorado, Maryland, New Mexico, and Rhode Island were set for 2027. 15 states had signed a non-binding memorandum of understanding committing to a zero-emission trucking future by 2050. From the warehouse districts of Newark to the logging roads of Oregon, the ripple effect of California's regulations was spreading across the American freight network. For truck dealers and manufacturers operating across state lines, the regulatory patchwork was becoming a logistics nightmare. If you're a dealer in New Jersey selling Class 8 trucks from your lot, you now had to meet CARB's zero-emission sales quotas, even though your customers were hauling loads across Pennsylvania and Ohio where no such rules existed. The diesel tractors your customers wanted to buy, the ones with proven range and established resale value, were being limited by regulation in your state because California wrote a rule 3,000 miles away. This is the part where things stopped being about air quality and became about constitutional law. In October 2023, the California Trucking Association filed a lawsuit against CARB, arguing the Advanced Clean Fleets rule imposed undue burdens on the industry. 7 months later, Nebraska's Attorney General assembled a coalition of 17 states and sued in federal court, arguing that California was using its market size and control of the nation's busiest ports to effectively impose its standards on the entire country. The lawsuit alleged violations of the Commerce Clause, claiming one state was regulating interstate commerce. But the legal challenge wasn't even the biggest threat to CARB's plans. The fleet regulation required a waiver from the Environmental Protection Agency before CARB could enforce the purchasing mandates against drayage operators, federal fleets, and large private companies. That waiver request had been filed with the EPA in November 2023. The Biden administration never acted on it, and months of silence from the EPA offices in Washington followed. Then, in January 2025, just days before the Trump administration took office, CARB made a calculation. They withdrew the waiver request entirely, acknowledging that the incoming administration was unlikely to approve it. Without the waiver, the fleet mandates couldn't be enforced. The most ambitious part of the diesel phase-out was effectively frozen. If you're keeping track, that's CARB itself pulling back before anyone in Washington forced them to. If you've been watching this and wondering how any of this affects your truck, subscribe. I break down the regulations reshaping the car and truck world every week. But California wasn't done fighting. Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order at the state capitol directing CARB to continue pursuing zero-emission vehicle requirements under state authority. And CARB still had the manufacturer mandate from the Clean Trucks rule, which already had its EPA waiver. Manufacturers still had to sell increasing percentages of electric trucks in California, whether fleet owners were buying them or not. What happened next turned the regulatory fight into a full-blown federal confrontation. The Trump administration moved quickly. On June 12, 2025, President Trump signed 3 Congressional Review Act resolutions at the White House that revoked the EPA waivers for California's Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, and the heavy-duty low NOx omnibus rule. Standing at the podium in Washington, Trump declared that he had rescued the American auto industry from destruction. The American Trucking Associations called it a monumental victory. Within hours, California fired back. Attorney General Rob Bonta filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration, joined by 10 other states, arguing the use of the Congressional Review Act to revoke Clean Air Act waivers was illegal. Legal scholars in the Government Accountability Office had already issued opinions suggesting Congress didn't have the authority to use the CRA this way. The case headed to the courts with no clear timeline for resolution. But the federal government wasn't just playing defense. In August 2025, the Department of Justice sued California directly, targeting the Clean Truck Partnership, a 2023 agreement between CARB and truck manufacturers. Under that deal, companies like Daimler and Volvo had committed to meeting California's zero-emission targets in exchange for CARB providing reasonable lead times on new rules. The DOJ argued that with the federal waivers revoked, California couldn't enforce those standards through a private partnership agreement either. Meanwhile, on the ground, the market was in turmoil. New Class 8 truck registrations in California dropped 50% year over year in 2024. Tractor registrations on dealer lots fell by 30%. Dealers reported that fleet buyers were paralyzed, unsure whether to invest in electric trucks that regulations might no longer require, or in diesel trucks that might face future restrictions if the courts ruled in California's favor. The uncertainty itself was doing more damage than any single regulation. Across the Atlantic, the picture looked different. In Europe, electric truck sales jumped 50% in the first 4 months of 2025. In China, electric trucks accounted for 15% of heavy-duty sales. American manufacturers like Mack and Peterbilt continued launching new electric models. The technology wasn't stopping just because the regulations were. Except for California, every state that had adopted the Clean Trucks rule for the 2025 or 2026 model years either delayed enforcement, paused implementation, or began considering repeal. Vermont's governor issued an executive order pausing enforcement through the end of 2026. Oregon's environmental department exercised enforcement discretion for model year 2025 and 2026 vehicles. Massachusetts offered enforcement flexibility for manufacturers who couldn't meet quotas. The states that had followed California's lead were now following its retreat. And through all of this, there was one regulation that kept grinding forward without much public attention. The Clean Truck Check program, California's heavy-duty inspection and maintenance system, requires nearly every diesel truck over 14,000 pounds operating on California highways to register in a state database, pay annual compliance fees, and pass semi-annual emissions testing. CARB technicians hook an OBD diagnostic device to your engine, check the exhaust system, and submit the results electronically. That includes trucks registered in other states. If your rig passes through California, even once you're subject to the program. Fail to comply, and your DMV registration gets blocked. And this is where things get personal for individual truck owners. CARB deploys automated license plate reader cameras and roadside emissions monitoring devices at highway checkpoints and border crossings across the state to catch non-compliant vehicles. A trucker based in Texas who hauls one load to the Port of Long Beach per month now has to register with CARB, pay the fee, and schedule testing with a credentialed technician, or risk having his plates flagged the next time he crosses the California state line. For owner-operators running cross-country routes, Clean Truck Check added a layer of regulatory exposure that had nothing to do with buying an electric truck. It was about proving your existing diesel truck still met California's emission standards twice a year, with tests performed by CARB credentialed technicians. The EPA under Trump told California it couldn't enforce this program against out-of-state vehicles. CARB said it would keep enforcing anyway. So where does all of this leave the American diesel truck? The regulatory picture is fractured. California's fleet mandate is being formally repealed, with CARB agreeing to propose the repeal by October 2025 and finalize it by August 2026. The manufacturer mandate lost its federal waiver and faces an uncertain legal future. The Clean Truck Partnership that was supposed to guarantee manufacturer cooperation is being challenged by the Department of Justice. And yet, the economics of electric trucks keep improving. Battery costs have dropped 40% since 2020. The Tesla Semi captured over 90% of California's Class 8 voucher applications. Fleet operators running fixed corridor routes in the Sun Belt are finding that electric trucks already cost less per mile than diesel when you factor in fuel and maintenance. The diesel engine has powered American commerce for nearly a century. It earned that position through reliability, range, infrastructure, and economics. Those advantages are narrowing, but they haven't disappeared. For long-haul operators in rural America, where the nearest DC fast charger might be 200 miles away, diesel isn't going anywhere soon. For port drayage and urban delivery in California and the Northeast, the transition is already underway, regulation or not. What California attempted was a forced acceleration of a transition that the market may eventually deliver on its own. Whether that push was visionary or reckless depends on where you sit, in the cab of a truck making payments on a rig that might be obsolete, or in a community downwind of a freight corridor where children grow up breathing diesel exhaust. The lawsuits will take years, the regulations will keep shifting, and somewhere on Interstate 5, a trucker with 300,000 miles on a Cummins engine is wondering whether the truck he bought 5 years ago will still be legal to drive in the state where he makes his living. That question doesn't have an answer yet, and that might be the most unsettling part of all.